promotion exam study made easy, where the method of study is simplified. You don't need to carry books around or stretch your eyes all day reading through books. All you need to do is to play our material and you listen. You can play it at your comfort zone while lying down or doing any other thing. You play it over and over and you master it all. So this is on education. We've concluded everything about public service rules. So if you want to get our materials in YouTube, everything about public service rule from chapter 1 to chapter 17 is completed, and now we are proceeding to education. So on the education, this particular video, I shall be taking theories of learning. Theories of learning actually specifically because one of our subscribers on YouTube personally demanded that I should make video on theories of learning and philosophy. So I'm starting with the theories of learning, after which I will also do that of philosophy. As usual, our training is followed with quiz. So after the training, we now go into the quiz. So endeavor to stay to the end, and during the quiz, try to evaluate yourself. Now, under the theories of learning, we shall consider the following topics, starting with introduction, that is introduction to theories of learning, the meaning of learning, then the major theories of learning. There are about 8 major theories of learning, but in this particular video, we shall consider 3. And then on episode 2, we take the remaining 1. So in this video, we shall be looking at the classical conditioning theory, then the operant conditioning theory, and then trial and error learning theory. So these are what we shall consider here. And please, before we proceed, if you are a returning viewer or coming across our video for the very first time, look around your screen. You see anywhere written subscribe. It can be in black background or white background or any background at all, written subscribe. So kindly hit on it before we continue. The essence is for you to get our materials, for YouTube to be able to make our materials available to you in real time. Anytime we upload materials like the YouTube will notify you that such material is available now, and it will also make you to get the previously uploaded ones before now. So that is the essence of hitting the subscribe button. Our materials are free. It does not cost a dime. So you can as well to go to YouTube in order to get the previously uploaded ones. That is everything about the new public service rule. Go to YouTube, go to the search engine. Now you see the search icon, click on the search icon. Then on the search icon, you type SALMUL, SALMUL, is one word, there's no space. Please, this is one word, there's no pick. I observe that somebody also used the same name, but on that his own there is a space. He separated SAL from MUL. So, but in this particular original one, there is no space between any of the letters. It's one word, SALMUL, SALMUL. Then you search. If you do that, YouTube will display all our materials. You see them, they are unique. Promotion exam studies made easy. It has unique color. You identify them once you see them. So, proceeding with this particular topic, lesson for today. So starting with introduction. So learning is a fundamental process in education through which individuals acquire knowledge, skills, attitudes, values, and behaviors. Individuals acquire knowledge, skills, attitudes, values, and behavior. So understanding how people learn is essential for teachers, school administrators, education officers, curriculum planners, inspectors, that is quality assurance personnel, and policy makers. Learning theories provide explanations about how learning occurs and offer guidance for effective teaching, curriculum development, assessment, and classroom management. Educational psychologists have developed various theories to explain the learning process. These theories help educators understand learner behavior, design effective instructional strategies, and improve educational outcomes. So, meaning of learning. So, learning can be defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior, knowledge, skills, attitudes, or understanding resulting from experience, study, practice, or instruction. So the key characteristics of learning. 1. Lifelong process. Learning begins at birth and continues throughout lifetime. It is a continuous acquisition of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors over time in everyday life, not only in school. 2. Change in behavior, that is performance or knowledge. Learning results in observable changes in behavior, attitudes, or understanding, which can be subtle or significant. Then 3, these are characteristics of learning. Active engagement. You can just absorb facts. You can't just absorb facts by watching. You can't just be watching and say you are learning. No, and you can't just absorb facts by watching. Effective learning requires active participation, curiosity, and motivation, rather than passive absorption of information. Then 4, individualized process. Each learner is unique. Past experiences, readiness, and personal perspectives influence how learning occurs. Then 5, multifaceted nature. Learning often involves multiple dimensions simultaneously, such as cognitive, emotional, and social development. It changes your whole personality, helps you gain new knowledge, that is the facts, develop new skills, that is doing things, and form new attitudes, how you behave. So these are the characteristics of learning: lifelong process, change in behavior, performance or knowledge, active engagement, individualized process, and multifaceted nature. Then number 6, problem solving and critical thinking. Learning frequently engages individuals in solving problems, analyzing situations, and applying knowledge creativity. So they are all characteristics of learning. Then number 7, observation and experience. Learning can occur through direct observation, imitation, experimentation, and practice, emphasizing experimental and contextual understanding. Then 8, adaptation and application. Learners adapt knowledge and skills to new situations, demonstrating the ability to transfer learning across contexts. Then 8, reflective process. Effective learning involves reflection, where individuals evaluate their experiences and understanding to deepen knowledge and inform future actions. 10, dynamic and continuous. Learning is not static. It evolves as individuals integrate new information with existing knowledge, continuously shaping behavior and cognition. Then 11, motivation and reinforcement. Learning is influenced by internal motivation, attention to stimuli, and reinforcement, which strengthen retention and the application of knowledge. So you still have, under characteristics of learning, you still have the problem solving and critical thinking, the observation and experience, reflective process, dynamic and continuous, and motivation and reinforcement. So 11 characteristics of learning we have considered so far. Then number 12 of it is social and environmental influence. Interaction with peers, teachers, and the environment plays a crucial role in shaping learning experiences and outcomes. Then 13, autonomy and self-direction. Learners develop independence, by seeking knowledge, making decisions, and taking responsibility for their learning process. So we have 13 of them, 13 learning characteristics. So you try to remember at least out of that 13, at least you should be able to remember 5 or more. Then in summary, learning is a complex, dynamic, and individualized process that involves active engagement, reflection, adaptation, relative permanence, experience and practice, goal-oriented development, and continuous development. Its characteristics highlight the interplay between experience, behavior, cognition, and social context, emphasizing that effective learning is meaningful, purposeful, and transferable across situations. So from there now, we are now proceeding to the major theories of learning. So starting with the first theory of learning, the classical conditioning theory. So classical conditioning theory was developed by an educationist, a psychologist called Ivan Pavlov in 1849 to 1936. Ivan Pavlov. So the overview of his theory. Classical conditioning theory explains learning as a process of forming associations between stimuli and responses. It shows how associations shape unconscious behaviors. Pavlov discovered this theory through experiments with dogs. Initially, food naturally caused dogs to salivate. Pavlov repeatedly rang a bell before presenting food. After several repetitions, the dogs began to salivate merely at the sound of the bell. Of course, why? Because they are expecting food, even when food was not presented. So, 4. Main parts or key concepts of classical conditioning. So, the main parts or key concepts of classical conditioning. So we have 1, the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus. So a trigger or stimulus that naturally produces a response without any learning. E.g., food naturally makes a dog drawl. So we have also number 2, unconditioned response. The unconditioned response. So natural automatic reaction or response to a trigger or stimulus, e.g., the dog drooling over the food. So you have the unconditioned stimulus, that is a stimulus that naturally produces a response without any learning. Then we have the unconditioned response, that is the natural automatic reaction or response to a trigger. So we have the conditioned stimulus. So previously neutral stimulus that becomes associated with the unconditional stimulus, or an originally neutral signal that, after being paired with the unconditional stimulus, now triggers a response, e.g., the sound of a bell. So you also have conditioned response. Conditioned response. So learned response to the conditioned stimulus or new signal, e.g., the dog drooling just when it hears the bell. So it has been conditioned. Then how it works. Before training, a bell, that is the neutral, makes the dog look but does not make it draw, while food, that is the natural trigger, makes the dog drool. So now on the neutral ground, normally bell makes the dog look, he will just look without drooling, but food makes the dog to drool on the natural ground. Then during the training, ring the bell and immediately give the dog food. So you are now ringing the bell and then presenting the food. Repeat this many times. The dog's brain connects the bell sound to the food. So when you now ring the bell and present the food, so after several repetition, the dog's brain will now connect the bell with the sound of the, we now connect the food with the sound of the bell. Then after the training, ring the bell by itself. The dog will now draw because it expects the food. Then educational implications. Teachers can create positive learning environments like calm and safe environment. Supportive words, e.g., that naturally make students relax. Sorry, let me take it. Educational implication, I'm taking it again. Teachers can create positive learning environments like calm and safe environment, supportive words, etc., that naturally make students relax. Positive classroom experiences encourage learners' interest. Emotional attitudes towards subjects can be developed through association. Reinforcement of positive classroom behaviors becomes easier. Classical conditioning can accidentally cause students to fear school if a subject is paired with failure or embarrassment. However, teachers can reverse this through counter conditioning. The process. High-stake exams. So unconditioned stimulus. So the high-tech exam is the unconditioned stimulus. Then naturally cause fear and sweaty palms. That is unconditioned response. So the sweaty palms is the unconditioned response. This fear generalizes to subject itself, like mathematics. To fix this, a teacher can pair math activities, that is conditioned stimulus, with low stakes, fun learning games, and candy, that is the new unconditioned stimulus. This breaks the fear bond and replaces it with excitement. Then limitations. So the limitations of Pavlov's theory. So it focuses mainly on automatic behaviors. It does not adequately explain complex learning processes. Then we now take on the operant conditioning theory. The operant conditioning theory was developed by B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner in 1904 to 1990. So the overview of B.F. Skinner's theory. Operant conditioning explains learning as behavior shaped by consequences. So something causes the behavior to change. Behaviors followed by rewards are strengthened, while behaviors followed by punishment tend to decrease. Skinner emphasized that behavior is determined by environmental factors rather than internal mental states, making psychology a science of observable action. 3 types of operant responses. So looking at the types of operant responses. So Skinner identified 3 types of responses or operands that can follow behavior. So 1, reinforcers. So positive or negative. So reinforcers can be positive or negative. So it increases the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. So the reinforcer, which can be positive or negative, can increase the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. Then we now have the punishers. The punishers can also be positive or negative, and that also decreases the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. So the punishers decrease the likelihood of the behavior being repeated, while the enforcers increase the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. Then we now have the third one, the neutral operants. these neutral operands have no effect on the future likelihood of the behavior. So these are the three types of operant responses. Now, how reinforcers and punishers shape our behavior from an early age. So children often experiment with different actions and quickly learn which ones brought rewards and which ones led to unpleasant outcomes. For instance, imagine you tried, if you smoke at school because the main consequence was gaining approval from the group you wanted to belong to. Because of the group you wanted to belong to, maybe it's a group of smokers also. For you to belong to that group, you smoke because you want to belong to. Then that is social acceptance acted as a positive reinforcer and increasing the likelihood that you would smoke again, because that gang is a smoking gang. Then if you were caught smoking and punished by teachers, suspended, and faced your parents' disapproval, those negative outcomes will serve as punishment, making you much less likely to repeat the behavior. So you see the two parts. So you smoke because you want to join a gang that smoke. Then in the process you are caught, the school does not tolerate it, your parent does not tolerate it, and you are punished for that. So that punishment now also will bring out the likelihood that you will not smoke again, so you will not repeat the behavior. So there are the two things, the enforcers and the punishers. Then positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement. Skinner considered ways in which behavior could be changed by treating someone differently based on what they did. This theory is known as operant conditioning. Positive reinforcement refers to the introduction of desirable or pleasant stimuli after the performance of a behavior. So after the performance of a behavior, introduce a pleasant stimuli. This reward can be used to further encourage the behavior or change a pre-existing one. A behavior is strengthened because it is followed by a rewarding stimulus, increasing the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. Then we now have types of positive reinforcement. There are 4 types of positive reinforcers that can be used to encourage behaviors. Each can be more or less effective depending on the individual and the situation. So we have the natural reinforcers. These occur directly as a result of the behavior. For example, an employee who consistently completes accurate, high-quality work on time may be given full autonomy over his schedule and methods. Supervision will be drawn. So already you have confidence on that one, because on a natural ground you find out that he completes his work and everything is accurate, so there is no need supervising that person. So it's a natural reinforcer. Then you also have now the second one, social reinforcers. Social reinforcers involve expressing approval for desirable behavior. For example, a teacher or parent may praise a child, or an employer may call an employee's work excellent. So this is social reinforcer. When a child does something good, you praise the child. You praise the child. So that is social reinforcer. Then we now have the tangible reinforcers. So under the tangible reinforcers, it involves actual physical rewards for desirable behavior. These could include candy, treats, toys, money, or some other desirable object. While these rewards can be powerful, their overuse can disincentivize the behavior when they are not used. So that is for the tangible reinforcer. So in this case, there is a physical award. Then for token reinforcers, Token reinforcers are points or tokens awarded for performing certain actions. These can then be exchanged for something of value. For example, a teacher may give a student points for completing assignments on time, which can be exchanged for a prize. So these are the types of positive reinforcers: the natural reinforcers, the social reinforcers, the tangible reinforcers, and the token reinforcers. So remember, the natural reinforcers just come in natural way, like maybe somebody that is always perfect in his work. You're supervising the person and you find out that every time, any time you give the person assignment, the person does it perfectly. So with time, you find naturally you withdraw yourself from that supervision to another thing, because you are already sure and confident that that person will make no mistake, do his work perfectly. So naturally you withdraw from him. Then the social reinforcers is where you give praise. A child does something good or an employer does something good, you give that verbal praise to encouragement or appreciation. Then for the tangible reinforcers is where you present physical gifts, for a job well done. Then for the token reinforcers, where you give like a point, and that points could later be exchanged for a prize. So they are the types of positive reinforcers. Then you also have positive reinforcement can also be used to encourage desirable behaviors on teachers. For example, a teacher whose learners perform exceptionally well may be given a bonus for dedication. So you can also use it on teachers. Then this type of positive reinforcement is often called a performance-related pay or pay for performance system. Then a staff who arrives at office on time every day and goes to class on time may receive a gift at the end of each school term as a way of reinforcing timeliness. Then we now have primary versus secondary reinforcers. Primary versus secondary reinforcers. In positive reinforcement, a behavior is strengthened because it is followed by a rewarding stimulus, increasing the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. Primary reinforcers are naturally rewarding because they satisfy basic biological needs such as food, water, or warmth. These reinforcers do not need to be learned. Then secondary reinforcers acquire their power through association with primary reinforcers. Examples include money, grades, or praise. Although they do not directly satisfy a biological need, they can be equally powerful motivators because they represent access to primary rewards. So let's look at the Skinner's rat experiment, because Skinner used rats, to experiment his theory. Skinner demonstrated positive reinforcement using his famous Skinner box experiment. He placed a hungry rat inside a box containing a lever. As the rat explored, it accidentally pressed the lever, causing a food pallet to drop into a tray. After several trials, the rat quickly learned to press the lever deliberately to obtain food. The reward of food acted as a positive reinforcer, strengthening the lever pressing behavior. You see, the rat was placed in the cage, so unconditionally the rat will be running around, but then it now happened that it stumbled on the lever. When he now stumbled on the lever, pressed the lever, food dropped. At first it was surprising, and of course at first his mind did not actually go that it was the liver. So along the line again, he touched the liver again, food dropped. So gradually, when repeatedly, when he touches the liver, the food drops. So he's already conditioned to that. He now knows that pressing the liver will drop food for him. So this experiment illustrated how consistent reinforcement can shape behavior through learned association. Positive reinforcement is common in daily life. For example, if a teacher gives a student some money each time he completes his homework, the reward strengthens the behavior of doing homework. Over time, the student becomes more likely to repeat this action, demonstrating how reinforcement encourages desired behaviors. So this is the Skinner box. You can see the rat, see the liver. This is a speaker. This is the Skinner box, the BF Skinner box. So the rat inside. So the speaker, the signal light, the liver. You can see the liver. So the food dispenser. The food dispenser. So to shock generator, electric grid. So once the cat pressed this lever, initially he did it by accident. When he pressed it by accident, the food dropped from the dispenser. Then another time he pressed it again by accident, food dropped. So occasionally, by the time he did it repeatedly, he now noticed that actually pressing the lever makes the food to drop. So it becomes conditioned to it. So he started pressing it intentionally for food to be dropping. Overall, the law emphasizes learners' reception and orientation as key prerequisites to successful learning. The right mindset and adequate. So next we have the Primark principle. So this Primark principle is normally regarded as grandma's rule. So the Primark principle expands on positive reinforcement by suggesting that a preferred activity, that is a high probability behavior, can be used to motivate a less preferred activity, that is a low probability behavior. So just like maybe there's something that a child likes very well, he likes doing, and there's something that he doesn't like doing like that. So you can withdraw that one that he likes doing very well first and condition him that he has to do the other one before you now give him the privilege to the one that he likes doing. So in order to get that one that he likes doing, he will be bound to act on the one that you want him to act on before he now get access to the one he likes doing. For example, a child might be told, first you eat vegetables. Maybe the child doesn't like to eat vegetable, but the child likes to eat dessert. He prefers to eat dessert. So, and you want the child to eat vegetable and not dessert like that. So, ordinarily, when the child is left alone, he will not eat the vegetable. He will just take dessert and eat dessert. But you can use that dessert now to now condition the child to now eat the vegetable first. So you can tell the child to eat the vegetable first, then you can give him the dessert. So based on that, because the child wants the dessert, he will now be forced to eat the vegetable. He will now be conditioned to eat the vegetable and then the dessert that he prefers. So this approach can be called grandma's rule. So it links a desirable activity, that is eating dessert, to a less enjoyable one, that is eating the vegetables, thereby increasing the likelihood of the less preferred behavior. So the Primark principle is considered one of the most effective and positive strategies for behavior modification because it leverages natural preferences rather than punishment to shape behavior. So we have secondary reinforcers. So secondary reinforcers acquire their power through association with primary reinforcers. Examples include money, grades, or praise. So though they do not directly satisfy a biological need, they can equally be powerful motivators because they represent access to primary rewards. So we have the key concepts. Looking at the key concepts, the reinforcement. Reinforcement is any consequence that strengthens a behavior. making it more likely to occur in the future. That's reinforcement strengthens a behavior, that is more likely to occur in the future. They will now have the positive reinforcement and the negative reinforcement. Then under the positive reinforcement is adding a desirable consequence, that is a desirable stimulus after a behavior, e.g. praise, awards, certificates, promotion to increase behavior. So maybe after a behavior has been exhibited, a positive behavior, then you can now come up with either reward or praise, so which will encourage that behavior to come again in the future. So here behavior is strengthened because it is followed by a rewarding stimulus, increasing the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. So introduced to increase a pleasant behavior. So the positive reinforcement happens normally after the behavior, not before the behavior. So after the behavior has come up, then you now strengthen it by giving maybe award, praise, or whatever that will now cause behavior to repeat itself. Then we now have the negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is removing an unpleasant condition to strengthen behavior. So you remove the unpleasant condition in order to strengthen the behavior. So it is keeping a boring task or excusing hardworking students from additional assignments to increase behavior. So introduced to decrease an unpleasant behavior. So the negative reinforcement, naturally the difference between them is that positive reinforcement increases, there is a likelihood of increasement of the pleasant behavior. So it increases the pleasant behavior, while the negative reinforcement decreases the unpleasant behavior. So both positive and negative reinforcement increase the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. The only difference is the type of consequence used to achieve this goal. So punishment. Punishment is any consequence that weakens a behavior, making it less likely to occur. Punishment decreases undesirable behavior. So punishment decreases undesirable behavior. Example, you can reprimand, you can withdraw privileges. Maybe there are some privileges the child has before, but due to the behavior you can withdraw them. Then detention, then educational implications. Then you have also positive punishment. So positive punishment involves adding an aversive stimulus or something unpleasant immediately following a behavior to decrease the likelihood of that behavior happening in the future. It aims to weaken the target behavior by associating it with an undesirable consequence. For example, a child receives a scolding, that is an aversive stimulus, from their parents immediately after hitting their sibling. So maybe a child hits his sibling, which is not pleasant. So in order to avoid the child repeating it again, you can instantly scold the child. Maybe it happens, so you scold the child. So this is intended to decrease the likelihood of the child hitting their sibling again. Then you have, that is for the positive punishment. Then you now have the negative punishment. So negative punishment involves removing a desirable stimulus or something rewarding immediately following a behavior to decrease the likelihood of that behavior happening in the future. So it aims to weaken the target behavior by taking away something the individual values or enjoys. So maybe a child does something, so you, because of that, you draw something that is pleasant from the child so that he does not repeat that unpleasant behavior. So for example, a teenager loses their video game privileges. So that is a desirable stimulus. They always like video game. So due to behavior, you now withdraw the privilege of them playing the game. So a child loses their video game privileges for not completing their course. So this is intended to decrease the likelihood of the teenager neglecting their course in the future. So Skinner box. A controlled environment used in experiments with animals that's rat, pigeon, to study behavior systematically. Animals learn to perform actions like liver pressing or key pecking to receive rewards or avoid punish. So, which we saw in the box. Effective classroom management. So, motivation through rewards, then development of good study habits, then behavior modification programs. So this can be used, for effective class management. So motivate the children through rewards, development of good study habits, and behavior modification through programs. Okay. Then limitations. So the limitations of that. So overemphasizes external rewards, dependency on rewards. The continuous external rewards can lead to reward dependency, where individuals perform tasks only for tangible incentives rather than personal satisfaction. So may neglect intrinsic motivation. So in settings like schools or workplace, this reliance can diminish intrinsic motivation and cause behavior to when one's rewards are removed. So that is the negative part of your fit. So we have the intrinsic versus the extrinsic motivation. So excessive use of external reinforcers risk overshadowing internal drives, potentially undermining long-term engagement or creativity. Balancing extrinsic rewards with support for learners' own interests and personal goals can foster sustainable, self-driven behavior change. So we proceed to the third learning theory, that is the trial and error learning theory by Thorndike, Edward Thorndike. The trial and error learning theory by Edward Thorndike. So the overview. Edward Thorndike's theory of learning emphasizes that behaviors are shaped by their consequences, forming the foundation of modern educational psychology and operant conditioning. Thorndike proposed that learning occurs through repeated attempts until a successful response is discovered. The formation of connections between stimuli and responses, a concept known as connectionism. He believed that when a specific action in response to a stimulus produces a satisfying outcome, the likelihood of repeating that behavior increases, whereas actions followed by unpleasant results are less likely to recur. This principle is formalized in his law of effect, which underpins reinforcement and punishment in learning. His experiments involve cats placed in puzzle boxes. Through repeated attempts, the cats learn how to escape. Edward L. Thorndike introduced three laws. So Edward L. Thorndike introduced three laws in his own theory. So and they are the law of effect, the law of readiness, and the law of exercise. So key experiments. Thorndike conducted pioneering experiments using puzzle boxes with cats. Hungry cats were placed in boxes that could be opened by performing a specific action, such as pulling a lever. Initially, the cats acted randomly, but over repeated trials, they learned to escape more quickly, demonstrating trial and error learning rather than sudden insight. These experiments provided empirical support for his laws of learning and highlighted the role of consequences in shaping behavior. Experiments showed through puzzle boxes that cats learn to escape via gradual trial and error, not sudden insight. Then law of effect. So looking at the laws. So law of effect. So law of effect stated that behaviors followed by positive outcomes are strengthened or likely to be repeated, while those followed by negative ones are weakened or stopped. Responses that produce a satisfying effect in a particular situation becomes more likely to occur again in that situation. And responses that produce a discomforting effect becomes less likely to occur again in that situation. For example, if a dog does a trick and gets a treat, it will do the trick again. Then if you touch a hot stove and get burned, you will not touch it again. So that is the law of effect. Then theory. Theory proposed connectionism, which suggests learning is the formation of a mental bond between a stimulus and a response. That is theory. Then legacy. So the legacy provided the crucial foundation for B.F. Skinner's, who later developed theory of operant conditioning. So the theory of Thorndike led B.F. Skinner to develop his own law of operant conditioning. Then application. Influence education by popularizing the use of practice drills, repetition, and reinforcement in the classroom. So this was a critical distinction in learning theory. So while classical conditioning depends on developing associations between events, Thorndike's law established the basis for operant conditioning, that is, learning from the consequences of our own behavior. The law of effect directly explains reinforcement and punishment. The satisfying effect Thorndike described is what we now call reinforcement. It strengthens the connection between a situation and an action, making you repeat it. So the discomforting effect is punishment. It weakens that connection, making you less likely to do it again in the future. So connectionism and other laws. So connectionism is Edward Thorndike's core theory of learning. Is the simple idea that learning is the process of forming a mental link or bond between a stimulus and a response. A stimulus-response bond is the mental connection you form between a specific situation, that is the stimulus, and the action you take in it, that is the response. So Thorndike believed that learning is the process of strengthening these bonds. When a bond is strong, seeing the stimulus like a puzzle box lever automatically triggers the correct response. Now, how does connectionism differ from classical conditioning? The biggest difference is voluntary versus involuntary. So the difference between connectionism and classical conditioning is voluntary and involuntary. So Pavlov's classical conditioning is about involuntary reflexes, like a dog passively learning to salivate at a bell. Thorndike's connectionism is about voluntary, that is, active behaviors. The cat chose to press the lever, and the consequence of that choice, getting a reward, is what strengthened the behavior. So what are the law of readiness and law of exercise, the other two laws of Thorndike? So we have the law of readiness, that is motivated to learn. So the law of readiness states that learners must be physically and mentally prepared for learning to occur. So before a child will be able to learn effectively, that child must be physically and mentally and even willing to learn before learning can occur. You don't force somebody to learn something when he's not ready. So this includes not being hungry, sick, or having other physical distractions or discomfort. So the person must be ready in all aspects, so physically and mentally. So he must not be hungry. You can't start teaching somebody something when the person is hungry. The comfort is not there. So then, or when he's sick, or when he has other distractions. No. So mentally, learners should be inclined and motivated to acquire the new knowledge or skill. If they are uninterested or opposed to learning it, the law states they will not learn effectively. The learners also require certain baseline knowledge and competencies before being ready to learn advanced concepts. So there must be pre-knowledge before a new one that will be introduced to build on the already known knowledge. If those prerequisites are lacking, acquisition of new information will be difficult. So in overall, the law emphasizes learners' reception and orientation as key prerequisites to successful learning. The right mindset and adequate foundation enables efficient uptake of new material. So that is for the law of readiness. Now to the law of exercise. So the law of exercise is practice makes perfect. The law of exercise states that connections are strengthened through repetition and practice. For example, if you want to learn to play a piano, you must practice daily. If you stop, you will forget the keys. Then you have the law of use. So the law of use states that the connection between a stimulus, that is a situation, and a response, that is a behavior, is strengthened when it is practiced. The more you do something, the better you get it at it. The law of, then you now have the law of disuse. The law of disuse states that the connection between a stimulus and a response is weakened when it is not practiced for a period of time. If you don't use a skill, you start to lose it. Frequent trials allow errors to be corrected and neural pathways related to the knowledge or skill to become more ingrained. Then we now have associations are reinforced through drill and rehearsal. Retrieval from long-term memory also becomes more efficient. In sum, repeated exercise of learned material cements retention and fluency over time. Forgetting happens when such connections are not actively preserved through practice. Then, like the puzzle box experiment. So Thorndike placed a hungry cat inside a puzzle box with a bit of food outside, just out of reach. To get the food, the cat had to accidentally perform a specific action, like pressing a lever or pulling a string, which would open the door. He then timed how long it took the cat to escape over multiple trials to see how quickly it learned. Simplified graph of the result of the puzzle box experiment. You can see the graph. So at first, that is the time required to escape and the trials. So at first, the first trial, it took him time up to 200 seconds, to get the door open to escape. Then at the second time, it took him maybe 60 seconds. Then at the third time, it took him 4 seconds. So the more he's practicing, the lesser time it takes him now to escape. So the more practice, and then to a point that he now masters how to escape. So he now have a horizontal trial. So when he now masters how to escape, that once he press the pedal, the door will open, he escape. So that is law of trial and error. And then repeated trial makes it to master the right thing to do. Then the result. Let's look at the result now. At first, when placed in the cages, the cats displayed unsystematic trial and error behaviors, trying to escape. They scratched, bite, and wandered around the cages without identifying patterns, without identifiable patterns. Then Tondik would then put food outside the cages to act as a stimulus and reward. The cats experimented with different ways to escape the puzzle box and reach the fish. Eventually, they would stumble upon the lever which opened the cage. When it had escaped, the cat was put in again, and once more, the time it took to escape was noted. In successive trials, the cats would learn that pressing the lever would have favorable consequences, and they would adopt this behavior, becoming increasingly quick at pressing the lever. After many repetitions of being placed in the cages, around 10 to 12 times, the cats learned to press the button inside their cages, which opened the doors, allowing them to escape in the cage and reach the food. That is the result. So the learning curve was gradual, not sudden. So gradually they learned what to do. So at first, on the first few trials, the cat took a very long time to escape. It performed many random useless behaviors, like scratching, mewing, biting, until it accidentally hit the lever or pulled the loop. So over time, with each successive trial, the time it took the cat to escape decreased, but only by small, incremental amount. Then the result. The graph showed a jagged but steady downward slope, which eventually flattened out as the cat mastered the task and would press the lever almost immediately. So now, what did the puzzle box experiment prove about animal learning? The experiment proved that animals, in this case cats, don't learn through sudden moments of insight or human-like reasoning. Instead, they learn by gradually connecting a specific action with a rewarding outcome. Over time, the accidental successful behaviors became more frequent, while the useless ones, like scratching at the bars, faded away. Now, why was the trial and error finding so important? Why was the trial and error finding so important? So this finding was so important because it provided the first scientific evidence for a new type of learning, which he called trial and error. So it showed that learning is a gradual process of stamping in successful responses and stamping out unsuccessful ones. So stamping in successful responses and stamping out unsuccessful ones. This simple mechanical process, not high-level thinking, was the key to performing new habits. Now, the critical evaluation of the law. So the strengths. Tondik in 1905 introduced the concept of reinforcement and was the first to apply psychological principles to the area of learning. His research led to many theories and laws of learning, such as operant conditioning. Skinner, 1938. Like Tondik put animals in boxes and observe them to see what they were able to learn. Thorndike's theory has implications for teaching such as preparing students mentally, using drills and repetitions, providing feedback and rewards, and structuring material from simple to complex. B.F. Skinner built upon Thorndike's principles to develop his theory of operant conditioning. Skinner's work involved the systematic study of how the consequences of a behavior influence its frequency in the future. He introduced the concepts of reinforcement, both positive and negative, and punishment to describe how consequences can modify behavior. The learning theories of Thorndike and Pavlov were later synthesized by Hull in 1935. So Thorndike's research drove comparative psychology for 50 years and influenced countless psychologists over that period of time and even still today. So why did Thorndike decide repetition alone is not enough? So at a point, Thorndike decided that repetition is not enough. So Thorndike also significantly revised his law of exercise. His original law stated that mere repetition, that is law of use, would strengthen a connection. However, his later work showed this was incorrect. He found that repetition without feedback or reward had almost no effect on learning. The original theory, practice makes perfect. Thorndike's original law of exercise pre-1930 had two parts. So you have the law of use, that is repeating a response in a situation strengthens the connection between them. So then the law of disuse. So the law of disuse, not using a response weakens that connection. That is, you forget. This was the classic drill and practice model. He believed, like his puzzle box experiment suggested, that sheer repetition stamped in the correct habit. The revision of Thorndike theory. Practice with reward makes perfect. So when Thorndike ran new experiments on human learning, he discovered his original law was wrong. In one famous experiment, he had subjects draw a 4-inch line with their eyes closed over and over again, thousands of times. The setup. The subjects repeated the action, that is the practice, but they were given no feedback on whether they were close to 4 inches or not. There is no reward or satisfaction. Then the result. After all those trials, their accuracy did not improve at all. They were just as bad as drawing the 4-inch line on the 3,000th time attempt as they were at the first. This experiment demonstrated that mere repetition, that is law of use, is useless for learning. Practicing the wrong thing or practicing without knowing you are doing it right has no effect. So the new conclusion. So Thorndike concluded that the law of effort, that is the law of reward, was far more important than the law of exercise. He essentially discarded the law of exercise as a primary law of learning. He revised his stance to say that repetition is only effective because it gives the law of effort more opportunity to operate. So old idea, repetition plus repetition plus repetition equals to learning. Then the new idea, repetition with reward plus repetition with reward plus repetition with reward equals to learning. In short, practice doesn't make perfect. Only perfect practice, that's where you are rewarded or at least know you are performing correctly, which is its own reward, leads to learning. Then 2, what are the main arguments against Thorndike's theories? The main arguments against Thorndike are that his theories are far too simplistic to explain real-world human learning. Critics, especially from the cognitive and Gatto's psychology schools, argue that he completely ignores the most important part of learning, that is thinking, understanding, and the insight. His theory treats the learner as a passive, that is black box, where a stimulus goes in and a response comes out, with the connection just being stamped in by a reward. This fails to explain how someone understands a concept. Furthermore, Thorndike himself had to revise his own laws. He later admitted that practice without feedback, that his law of exercise, is mostly useless, and that punishment is not a simple mirror image of reward and is far less effective at changing behavior. Then 3. Why do some critics say his theory is too mechanistic? So why some critics say his theory is too mechanistic? So this is the single biggest criticism. Mechanistic means his theory reduces learners to simple machines, like an animal or a robot, who just react to the environment. In Thorndike's model, learning isn't a process of thinking or understanding. It's just the automatic, mechanical stamping in of a habit or a bond, because a reward followed. It is very passive process. So Gestalt psychologists like Wolfgang Kohler directly attacked this. Kohler's experiment with chimpanzees showed that they could solve a problem all at once in a flash of insight, not just by gradual trial and error. This suggests a complex internal cognitive process, a mental map, which Thorndike's mechanistic model completely ignores. So 4. Does his animal-based research apply to complex human learning? So critics argue that his animal research does not apply well to complex human learning, and here is why. A hungry cat in a puzzle box is learning a simple physical try and error task to get a basic survival reward, which is food. This is a very poor model for how a human learns something abstract like physics, history, or philosophy. The human learning is driven by language, social motivation, and intrinsic curiosity, not just external rewards. For example, Thorndike's theory can explain how a student memorizes a multiplication table using drills, but it completely fails to explain how that student understands the concept of multiplication itself, or how they can creatively apply that concept to a totally new problem. So application to students' learning. Thorndike's theory, when applied to student learning, emphasizes several key factors: the role of the environment, breaking tasks into detailed parts, the importance of student responses, building stimulus-response connections, utilizing prior knowledge, repetition through drills and exercise, and giving rewards or praise. How are Thorndike's learning theories applied in classroom today? So now let's see how his theories are applied in classroom today. You see Thorndike's theories everywhere in modern classrooms, especially in how we structure lessons and manage behavior. His law of effect is a simple idea of rewards, which we use in the form of verbal praise, good grades, sticker charts, or token economics, where students earn points for participation. His law of exercise, the practice makes perfect rule, is the foundation for giving homework, drilling multiplication tables, or using educational software that has students repeat a skill until they achieve mastery. Finally, His core idea of connectionism is why teachers break down complex subjects into smaller, sequential steps, ensuring a student masters one concept before moving to the next. What are the benefits of using drills and repetition in learning? The main benefit of drills and repetition, which Thorndike called the law of exercise, is to achieve automaticity. When you practice a foundational skill like basic maths, facts, or spelling, you strengthen that stimulus response bond so much that it becomes effortless and automatic. This is a massive cognitive benefit. It dramatically reduces a student's cognitive load, which means their working memory is freed up. So instead of wasting mental energy trying to remember what is 7 times 8, they can dedicate all their brain power to solving the more complex, multi-step problem that uses that fact. So why is providing immediate feedback and rewards important according to this theory? Immediate feedback is the most critical part of Thorndike's law of effect, because it is all about timing. The satisfying feeling of a reward, like praise or a correct answer on a screen, must happen immediately after the correct response. This immediacy is the glue that fuses that specific action to that specific stimulus. If the feedback is delayed, the student might not remember exactly what they did to get the right answer, or worse, their brain might accidentally associate the reward with a different, unrelated behavior they perform in the meantime. Immediacy ensures you are strengthening the correct bond. Now, the educational implications. Thorndike's work had a profound impact on education. His theory suggested that practice, repetition, and reinforcement are essential for learning. Teachers can apply these principles by preparing students for learning, providing structured practice, and giving timely feedback to reinforce correct responses. His ideas laid the groundwork for behaviorist approaches and influenced later psychologists, including B.F. Skinner, in developing operant conditioning. Then practice improves performance. Drill and repetition are important. Readiness enhances learning effectiveness, and positive outcomes encourages further learning. So the legacy. Thorndike's research extended beyond classroom learning to broader psychological and behavioral studies. His emphasis on quantitative measurement and observable behavior helped establish psychology as a scientific discipline. His laws of learning continue to inform educational strategies, behavior modification, and cognitive research. In summary, Edward Thorndike's theory of learning demonstrates the experience, consequences, and repetition are central to acquiring new behaviors, providing a systematic framework for understanding both animal and human learning. So we now have the limitations to Thorndike's theory. So the limitations of Thorndike's theory of learning include: 1. Empirical basis. While Thorndike's theory is based on extensive experimental research, it may not fully account for the complexities of human learning and cognitive processes. Then we also have neglect of mental processes. The theory does not fully explain the role of mental processes such as perception, memory, and reasoning in learning, which are crucial for higher order thinking and problem solving. So limited scope. Thorndike's theory primarily focuses on simple mechanical learning, more suitable for simple learning tasks. So we now go to the quiz aspect. As usual, for each question, try to provide the answer before we see the correct answer. So question 1, that is section A now under general concepts of learning. So we have question 1. Learning is best defined as, so how do we define learning? A, temporary change in behavior due to fatigue. B, relatively permanent change in behavior resulting from experience. C, growth in physical size. Then D, acquisition of certificates. So which one best define learning? So the correct answer is relatively permanent change in behavior resulting from experience. That is option B. Then question 2. Which characteristics distinguishes learning from maturity? Characteristic that distinguishes learning from maturity. A, learning is influenced by experience. B, learning occurs naturally. Then C, learning is hereditary. Then D, learning is age dependent only. So which characteristic distinguishes learning from maturity? So the correct option is learning is influenced by experience. So experience is the remember the adage that says experience is the best teacher. So you learn a lot through experience. So question 3. The primary concern of learning theories is to explain A, how learning occurs, how schools are administered. C, how budgets are prepared. And D, how examinations are conducted. So what's the primary concern of learning theories? So quickly your answer. So then the correct answer is to how learning occurs. That is option A. Question 4. Which of the following is not a characteristic of learning? So which of this is not a characteristic of learning? A, it involves change in behavior. Does learning involve change in behavior? 2. B, it is relatively permanent. Is learning permanent? Then C, it results from experience. Remember the question says which is not a characteristic of learning. Then option D says it's always observable. So which of them is not a characteristic? Quickly your answer before I tell us the correct answer. So now the correct answer is option D. It is always observable. So that is not a characteristic of learning, but all other ones are characteristics of learning. It involves a permanent change. So it results from experience, and it also involves a change in behavior. But it's not for just observing like that. It's not a learning characteristics. Question 5. The educational significance of learning theories lies mainly in the ability to A, guide instructional practice. B, replace curriculum. That is, the educational significance of learning theories lies mainly in their ability to A, guide instructional practices. B, replace curriculum. C, eliminate examinations. And D, determine salaries. So which is the correct option? So a second. Then of course the correct option is guide instructional practice. That is A. So the educational significance of learning theories lies mainly in their ability to guide instructional practices. Question 6. A teacher who understands learning theories is better able to A, improve instructional effectiveness. B, increase school revenue. C, prepare budgets. And D, conduct audits. So the correct option, so of course the teacher who understands learning theories is better able to, of course, improve instructional effectiveness. Then question 7. Learning theories are useful for all except, so learning theories are useful for all except A, curriculum development. B, teaching improvement. C, student assessment. And D, tax administration. So which of them is learning theory not useful for? So the correct option is option D. Learning theories are useful for all. It is useful for curriculum development. It's also useful for teaching improvement, and it's also useful for student assessment, but it is not useful for tax administration. Question 8. The process of acquiring knowledge, skills, and attitudes is known as the process of acquiring knowledge, skill, and attitudes is known as A, learning, B, development, C, growth, and D, maturity. So of course that process is known as learning, option A. Question 9. Educational psychologists study learning primarily to A, improve educational outcomes, B, build classrooms, C, recruit teachers, D, conduct inspections. So of course educational psychologists study learning primarily to, of course, improve educational outcomes. That's option A. Question 10. Learning theories contribute to A, effective educational decision making, B, school construction only, C, student admission only, and D, financial auditing. Of course, learning theories contribute to effective educational decision making. That is option A. Question 11. So here now we shall be looking at classical conditioning. Classical conditioning. So classical conditioning theory was developed by, remember who developed classical conditioning? A, B.F. Skinner, B, Ivan Pavlov, C, Albert Bandura, and D, Jerome Bruner. So who developed classical conditioning? Of course, it was developed by Ivan Pavlov. That is option B. Classical conditioning is developed by Ivan Pavlov, while operant conditioning was developed by B.F. Skinner. Then question 12. Pavlov's experiment involve A, rats, B, dogs, C, monkeys, and D, children. So what did Pavlov use for his own experiment? Of course, Pavlov used the dogs for experiment. So Pavlov's experiment involved the use of dog, where the dog salivate. So when he hears the bell, which was already conditioned with bringing of food. So question 13. In Pavlov's experiment, food represented the A, conditioned stimulus, B, unconditioned stimulus, C, conditioned response, and D, neutral stimulus. So remember Pavlov's experiment. So what is the food used for? You represent. Remember the dog was conditioned with bell, then food. So that is, of course, unconditioned stimulus, B. So in Pavlov's experiment, food represented the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. Then question 13. Salivation caused naturally by food is conditioned response. Salivation caused naturally by food. A, conditioned response, B, neutral response, C, unconditioned response, and of course D, learned response. So the correct option is unconditioned response. So salivation is caused naturally by food. So it's called naturally by food is called unconditioned response. Question 15. After conditioning, the bell became unconditioned stimulus, B, conditioned stimulus, C, unconditioned response, and D, reinforcement. So after conditioning the dog, so the bell became what? Of course, the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. Becomes the conditioned stimulus. Once the dog now hears the bell, he expects food. We begin. Then for question 16, classical conditioning Classical conditioning emphasizes A. Association between stimuli and response. B. Problem solving. C. Social interaction. D. Discovery learning. So quickly, classical conditioning of course emphasizes association between stimulus and response. That is classical conditioning. Pavlov's theory. Then question 17. Which classroom situation reflects classical conditioning? Which classroom situation reflects classical conditioning? A. Students becoming anxious whenever a teacher enters due to previous experience. Understand the question very well. Which classroom situation reflects classical condition? So students becoming anxious whenever a teacher enters due to previous experience. B. Students receiving rewards for good performance. C. Students observing a role model. And D. Students working in groups. So which of them reflects classical condition? Of course, the one that reflects classical condition is that student becomes anxious whenever a teacher enters due to previous experience. So something that has happened before, experience, constant experience that has happened before. So whenever they see the teacher, they relate it to previous experience. So they'll be anxious over that. So question 18. Classical conditioning is most associated with A. Reflexive behavior. B. Abstract reasoning. C. Creative thinking. And D. Self-actualization. Of course, classical conditioning is most associated with reflective behavior. That is option A. Then question 19. A major limitation of classical conditioning is that it A. Ignores complex mental processes. B. Overemphasizes cognition. C. Focuses on discovery learning. And D. Promotes social interaction. Of course, major limitation of classical conditioning is that it ignores complex mental processes. Question 20. A student feels anxious every time they enter the examination hall. Originally, the anxiety was caused by repeatedly experiencing stressful exams in that room. So, originally the anxiety was caused by repeatedly experiencing stressful exams in that room. So, because of that, the student feels anxious whenever they enter the examination hall. So, what is the conditioned stimulus? So, the question now, what is the conditioned stimulus? So which conditioned stimulus will you attach that one to? A. Stressful exams. B. Anxiety. C. Examination hall. So which of them is a conditioned stimulus? And then D. Poor grades. So of course, the correct answer for that is that a student feels anxious every time they enter the examination hall. So originally, the anxiety was caused by repeatedly experiencing stressful exams in that room. And so the conditioned stimulus there is the examination hall. So examination hall. So whenever they enter examination hall, the anxiety began. So that is the conditioned stimulus. Then question 21. At the start of the school year, the bell has no special meaning to new students. After several weeks, students begin packing their bags immediately when the bell rings. So now what happened? So what is the conditioned response here? So remember, at the start of the school year, the bell has no special meaning to new students. Then after several weeks, students begin packing their bags immediately when the bell rings. So what is the conditioned response? A. The bell ringing. B. Packing bags when the bell rings. C. End of classes. and D, the students themselves. So of course the condition response there is packing their bags when the bell rings. So they've been conditioned to pack the bags once the bell rings. Option B. Question 22. A student has learned to become alert whenever a particular teacher says this will be on the test. Later, the student becomes alert whenever any teacher uses a similar phrase. So A, this is the example of extinction. Remember, let me take that question again. A student has learned to become alert whenever a particular teacher says this will be on the test. Then later, the student becomes alert whenever any teacher uses a similar phrase. So this is an example of what? A, extinction. B, stimulus discrimination. C, stimulus generalization. D, spontaneous recovery. So of course, from one particular teacher, they now generalize it to other teachers. So it is a stimulus generalization. That is option C. So question 23. A student becomes nervous whenever they stand at the front of the classroom because previous presentations were embarrassing. After many successful presentations with positive feedback, the nervousness gradually disappears. So this reduction in the condition response is called A, acquisition. B, extinction. C, generalization. D, higher order conditioning. So the student were nervous whenever they stand in the front of the classroom because of previous presentations were embarrassing. But after many successful presentations with positive feedback, the nervousness disappeared. Of course, the reduction in the condition response is called extinction. That is B. So the nervousness stopped due to successful feedback afterwards. So the nervousness stopped. So that is extinction. Question 24. A particular chime always plays before important school announcements. Eventually, students become attentive as soon as they hear the chime. So in this situation, the chime is functioning as A. So A, unconditioned stimulus. B, conditioned stimulus. C, unconditioned response. And D, conditioned response. Of course, that is particular chime always plays before important school announcements. So of course, that chime now is virtually a conditioned stimulus. So whenever they hear the stimulus, the chime play, their ears will be open for announcements. So it's a conditioned stimulus. So question 25. A student first learns that a notification sound from a homework app means an assignment is due. So a student first learns that a notification sound from a homework app means an assignment is due. Later, seeing the app icon alone makes the student feel concerned about homework deadlines. So the app icon is an example of A, second order conditioned stimulus. B, an unconditioned stimulus. C, conditioned response. And D, stimulus discrimination. Of course, the app now is seen as a second order conditioned stimulus. So when they hear the sound from the homework app, it means assignment is due. So later, once they see the app, it will make them to now remember that the assignment will be due. So it's a second order condition stimulus. So question 26. So here we'll be looking at operant conditioning. So operant conditioning theory was proposed. Who proposed the operant conditioning? A, by Pavlov. B, the Skinner. D, the Piaget. And D, Vygotsky. Of course, the operant conditioning is by Skinner. That is option B, B.F. Skinner, with his rats. Then 27. Operant conditioning focuses on A. Consequences of behavior, B. Stimulus association only, C. Cognitive structures, and D. Observation. Of course, operant conditioning focuses on the consequences of behavior. Question 28. Behavior followed by a pleasant consequences is likely to of course, increase, B. Decrease, C. Disappear, and D. Remain unchanged. Definitely, a behavior followed by a pleasant consequence is likely to increase. That is option A. Question 29. Given a student praise for correct answer is an example of A. Positive reinforcement, B. Negative reinforcement, C. Punishment, and D. Extinction. Of course, giving the student praise for correct answer is an example of positive reinforcement. That is option A. Question 30. Negative reinforcement involves removing an unpleasant condition, B. Punishing behavior, C. Ignoring behavior, and D. Criticizing learners. So, of course, negative reinforcement involves removing an unpleasant condition. That is option A. Question 31. The major concept in Skinner's theory is A. Reinforcement, B. Intelligence, D. Heredity, and maturity. Of course, the major concept in Skinner's theory is reinforcement. That is option A. Question 32. A student studies hard to avoid criticism. This illustrates a student studies hard to avoid criticism. This illustrates a negative reinforcement, B. Positive reinforcement, C. Punishment, and then D. Modeling. So, of course, it's negative reinforcement. You study hard to avoid criticism is a negative reinforcement. So, question 32. Which is not a form of reinforcement? Which of this is not a form of reinforcement? A. Positive reinforcement, B. Negative reinforcement, C. Extinction, and D. Punishment. Which one is not a form of reinforcement? Of course, punishment is not a form of reinforcement. Question 34. The educational implication of Skinner's theory is A. Use of rewards to strengthen learning, B. Elimination of motivation, C. Rejection of feedback, D. Avoidance of assessment. So, which is the correct option? So, of course, the educational implication of Skinner's theory is use of rewards to strengthen learning. That is option A. 35. What is the process of strengthening a behavior by providing a reward? A. Punishment, B. Reinforcement, C. Extinction, and D. Generalization. Of course, the process of strengthening a behavior by providing a reward is called reinforcement. That is option B. Question 36. Which type of reinforcement involves adding a pleasant stimulus after a desired behavior? A. Negative reinforcement, B. Extinction, C. Positive reinforcement, and D. Punishment. Of course, adding a pleasant stimulus after a desired behavior is positive reinforcement. That is option C. So, question 37. Which of the following is an example of negative reinforcement? A. Giving a student a prize for good work, B. So, which is a negative reinforcement, B. Removing homework when students perform well, C. Scolding a student for lateness, then C. Suspending a student for misconduct. So, the one that is which of the following is an example of negative? So, the example of negative reinforcement is that it's removing homework when students perform well. It's a negative reinforcement. Then question 38. Question 38. What happens when reinforcement is no longer provided for a learned behavior? That is extinction. A. Shaping. B. Chaining. C. Extinction. Then D. Modeling. Of course, when reinforcement is no longer provided for a learned behavior, it leads to extinction. Question 39. The device Skinner used to study animal behavior. The device Skinner used to study animal behavior is called A. Puzzle box. B. Conditioning chamber. And D. Large cage. C. Behavior booth. So for Skinner, the device is used is conditioning chamber. That is the Skinner box. Option B. Question 40. Which concept refers to reinforcing successive approximations of a desired behavior? Which concept refers to reinforcing successive approximations of a desired behavior? A. Extinction. B. Shaping. C. Generalization. And D. Punishment. Okay, this concept that refers to reinforcing successive approximations of a desired behavior is shaping. Question 41. In Skinner's theory, punishment is used to A. Increase behavior. B. Maintain behavior. C. Decrease behavior. And D. Ignore behavior. Of course, in Skinner's theory, punishment is used to decrease a behavior. 42. A student studies hard because they receive praise from their teacher. This is an example of A. Positive reinforcement. B. Negative reinforcement. D. C. Positive punishment. And D. Extinction. Of course, the students study hard because they receive praise from the teacher is an example of positive reinforcement. Question 43. Question 43. Skinner's theory emphasizes learning through A. Observation. B. Insight. C. Consequences of behavior. And D. Maturity. Of course, Skinner's theory emphasizes learning through consequences of behavior. That is option C. 44. According to Skinner, behavior is primarily influenced by A. Heredity alone. B. Unconscious motives. C. Environmental consequences. And D. Cognitive development stages. Of course, behavior is primarily influenced by environmental consequences. Question 45. Which statement best describes operant conditioning? A. Learning occurs through observing others. B. Learning occurs through association between stimuli. C. Learning occurs through trial and error influenced by consequences. And D. Learning occurs through sudden insight. Of course, the statement that best describes operant conditioning is learning occurs through trial and error influenced by consequences. That is option C. So we now move to Thorndike's theory. Question 46. Question 46. Thorndike is associated with A. Trial and error learning. B. Discovery learning. C. Social learning. And D. Humanistic learning. Of course, Thorndike is associated with trial and error learning. Trial and error learning. 47. Thorndike conducted experiments using A. Dogs, B. Cats, C. Monkeys, and D. Birds. Of course, Thorndike conducted experiments using cats. Then 48. The law of effect states that A. Satisfying consequences strengthen behavior. B. Learning occurs through observation. B. Learning depends on intelligence. And D. Learning occurs through conditioning. So the correct option for the law of effect is that satisfying conditions strengthens behavior. That is option A. Law of effect, satisfying conditions strengthens behavior. Question 49. The law of exercise emphasizes A. Practice, B. Observation, C. Punishment, and D. Social interaction. The law of exercise, of course, is emphasizes on practice. Practice makes perfect. A. Question 50. The law of readiness suggests that A. Learners must be prepared to learn. B. Reinforcement is essential. C. Observation promotes learning. And D. Intelligence determines achievements. Of course, the law of readiness suggests that learners must be prepared to learn. So that is option A. So question 51. Thorndike's puzzle box studies challenged the idea that animals could learn from consequences. B. Learn exclusively through sudden insight. C. Form associations between stimuli and responses. And D. Improve performance with repeated attempts. Of course, Thorndike's puzzle box studies challenge the idea that animals could learn exclusively through sudden insights. That is option B. Question 52. Which scenario would Thorndike most likely interpret as evidence of learning? A. A child suddenly understands a puzzle without prior attempts. B. A learner acquires knowledge without any observable change in behavior. C. A student dreams about solving a problem. And D. A cat escapes a box more quickly over successive trials due to successful responses being strengthened. So which scenario would Thorndike most likely interpret as evidence of learning? Of course, the evidence of learning there is that a cat escapes a box more quickly over successive trials due to successive response being strengthened. Question 53. A student repeatedly solves algebraic problems and gradually becomes faster and more accurate. According to Thorndike, this improvement is primarily explained by A. Latent learning. B. Operant conditioning through shaping. C. Strengthening of stimulus response connections through practice. And D. Insight learning. Of course, the correct option is strengthening of stimulus / response connections. There is connection between stimulus and response through practice. That is option C. Then for question 54, which classroom situation best demonstrates the law of effect? The law of effect. Which classroom situation best explains it? A. Students copy notes from the board. B. A learner receives immediate positive feedback for correct pronunciation and continues improving. C. A student watches a documentary. And D. Learners discuss a topic without feedback. So which classroom situation best demonstrates the law of effect? Of course, the correct one that best demonstrates the law of effect is that a learner receives immediate positive feedback for correct pronunciation and continues improving. Question 55. According to Thorndike's law of effect, which situation is most likely to strengthen a behavior? A student receives praise immediately after solving a problem correctly. B, a student receives a difficult assignment after answering correctly. Then B, a student observes another student being rewarded. And D, a student memorizes information without practice. So which, according to Thorndike's law of effect, which situation is most likely to strengthen behavior? Of course, the one that is most likely to strengthen behavior is that a student receives praise immediately after solving a problem correctly. That's option A. Then for question 56, Thorndike's experiments with puzzle boxes primarily led him to conclude that learning occurs through A, insightful problem solving, B, classical conditioning, then C, trial and error responses that are gradually selected, then D, social imitation. So the correct one, that Thorndike's experiment with puzzle box primarily led him to conclude that learning occurs through trial and error responses that are gradually selected. Then question 57, which statement best reflects Thorndike's connectionist theory? A, learning is the sudden perception of relationships. B, learning depends mainly on unconscious drives. C, learning involves forming bonds between stimuli and responses. And D, learning occurs only through observation. So which statement best reflects Thorndike's connectionist theory? So the one that best reflects his theory is that learning involves forming bonds between stimuli and responses. So question 58, a teacher wants to apply Thorndike's law of exercise. Which strategy is most appropriate? A, encouraging students to discover concepts independently without repetition. B, providing repeated opportunities to practice a skill. C, using punishment whenever errors occur. And D, focusing only on conceptual understanding. So which can teacher apply according to Thorndike's law of exercise? So the correct option is that the teacher provides repeated opportunities to practice a skill, because Thorndike believes in practice. Practice makes perfect. Then for question 59, which of the following is a criticism of Thorndike's original theory? A, it overemphasized hereditary factors. B, it ignored the role of reinforcement. And C, it underestimated cognitive processes and insight in learning. D, it rejected observable behavior. So which of that is a criticism of Thorndike's original theory? So the correct one that is a criticism of Thorndike's original theory is that it underestimated cognitive processes and insight in learning. Question 60. Thorndike's law of readiness suggests that learning is most effective when A, reinforcement is delayed. B, tasks are completely unfamiliar. C, learning occurs through observation only. And then D, learners are mentally and physically prepared to act. Of course, the correct one is that learners are mentally and physically prepared to act. Good. Then question 61. Which classroom practice could Thorndike be most likely to criticize? A, frequent guided practice with feedback. B, rewarding successful performance. C, providing opportunities for repetition. And D, expecting mastery after a single explanation with little practice. So which classroom practice would Thorndike be most likely to criticize? Of course, that is expecting mastery after a single explanation with the practice. Because Thorndike believes in multiple practices and he believes in rewarding and all that. So question 62. A language teacher gradually changes the cue for a response. Initially, students respond to pictures, then to written words, and finally to spoken words. Which subordinate law is being applied? A. Multiple response. B. Response by analogy. C. Associative shifting. And D. Readiness. So the correct option is what? Associative shifting. So question 63. Which statement represents the strongest modern criticism of Thorndike's original connectionism? So which statement represents the strongest modern criticism of Thorndike's original connectionism? A. It ignored observable behavior. B. It failed to recognize the importance of practice. C. It placed insufficient emphasis on mental processes such as reasoning, understanding, and problem solving. And then D. It rejected environmental influence. Of course, the statement that is strongest modern criticism of Thorndike's original connection is that it placed insufficient emphasis on mental processes such as reasoning, understanding, and problem solving. That is option C. Then for question 64, a school adopts a reward system where students earn points for completing assignments. Assignment completion rates increases significantly, but students show little conceptual understanding. Which evaluation of Thorndike's theory is most accurate? A. The results completely disprove Thorndike's theory. B. The results support Thorndike's claim that consequences influence behavior but highlight limits in explaining deeper understanding. Then C. The results support Castle's theory alone. And D. The results demonstrate that practice is unnecessary. So the correct option is that the results support Thorndike's claim that consequences influence behavior but highlights limits in explaining deeper understanding. That is option B. So question 65. Which educational practice best reflects both the law of exercise and the law of effort? A. Giving students a lecture without assessment. B. Requiring repeated skill practice and providing positive feedback for improvement. C. Allowing students to learn entirely through observation. And D. Assessing students only at the end of the semester. So which educational practice best reflects both the law of exercise and the law of effort? So the correct one is requiring repeated skill practice and improving positive feedback for improvement. So I'm providing positive feedback for improvement. So requiring repeated skill practice and providing positive feedback for improvement. Then question 66. A teacher notices that students use different strategies to solve a challenging problem before finding the correct one. Thorndike would describe this behavior as A. Insight learning. B. Latent learning. C. Multiple response. Then D. Classical conditioning. So the correct option is that is multiple response. That is, a teacher notices that students use different strategies to solve a challenging problem before finding the correct one. So Thorndike would describe this behavior as multiple response. Question 67. A student who has mastered solving linear equations applies a similar method when learning quadratic equations. Which subordinate principle best explains this transfer? A. Response by analogy. B. Law of effect. C. Law of frequency. And D. Associative shifting. Of course, the correct option is response by analogy. Then question 68. A researcher argues that Thorndike's theory cannot fully explain situations in which learners suddenly discover solutions without trial and error. This criticism is most closely associated with A. Humanistic psychology. B. Psychoanalytic theory. C. Gestalt psychology. And D. Functionalism. So the correct option for that is Gestalt psychology. Question 69. A mathematics teacher provides immediate praise whenever students correctly apply a newly learned formula. Over time, students use the formula more frequently and accurately. Which principle of Thorndike's theory best explains this outcome? A. Law of readiness. B. Law of multiple response. C. Law of associative shifting. And then D. Law of effect. So the correct one is law of effect. That is, a mathematics teacher provides immediate praise whenever students correctly apply a newly learned formula. So over time, students use the formula more frequently and accurately. Which principle of Thorndike's theory best explains this? That is the law of effect. Question 70. A student is forced to participate in a science experiment despite having no prior preparation or interest. The student performs poorly and becomes frustrated. Which law best describes this situation? Let me take the question again. A student is forced to participate in a science experiment despite having no preparation or interest. The student performs poorly and becomes frustrated. Which law best explains this situation? A. Law of exercise. B. Law of readiness. C. Law of belongingness. And D. Law of frequency. Of course, the correct one is the law of readiness. The student was not ready. So remember, Thorndike's law is law of readiness, law of effect, and law of exercise. So that is that. We've come to the end of this episode. So thank you. If you are yet to hit the subscribe button at this point, please kindly check around. If you still subscribe on your page, means we've not subscribed, and by that you'll be missing our materials. You will not have our materials. So to have our materials in real time and then get the previous ones, kindly hit the subscribe button. Of course, you can also like us, you can comment, and then share to your friends and family. If you find value in it, they will also find value in it. It is free of charge. So the next topic, we shall still continue on the theories of law. We continue on the theories of learning. We take this second part of the theories of other theories of learning. Thank you, and see you in my next video.